Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez, and I'm really excited for this episode as we will be tackling one of the most controversial and debated topics, evolution. If you're like me, and I'm sure you are, in public school, you were taught that Darwinian evolution is a scientific fact, and that's that. But is Darwinian evolution really true? What's the evidence for it? And are we merely the byproduct of an unguided process by random mutations over long periods of time? Are there alternative explanations for Darwin's theory? And how has Darwin's theory stood the test of time? My guest today, Dr. Casey Luskin, is here with me to answer these questions and indeed show that there's a rather convincing alternative to Darwin's theory being intelligent design. Casey, thank you so much for jumping on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Jacob.
It's a blessing to have you, because I was just telling you before we started recording, you and those at Discovery Institute have been super impactful, just showing the truth for intelligent design, pushing back on some of the what is considered brute facts of Darwinian evolution, which we're going to talk about today. So, but just for our listeners, just so they're aware of your background briefly, Casey is the Associate Director of the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute. He earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees in earth sciences from the University of California in San Diego, where he studied evolution extensively. And he holds a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg. And I found this really interesting. He earned a law degree from the University of San Diego, where he focused on First Amendment law, education law, and environmental law. That is quite the arsenal, Casey, I must say.
Spent too much time in school is what it comes down to. My dad always says I should have been a plumber and would have made a lot more money, and he's probably right about that. So
That's really funny. Briefly, tell me a little bit about your law degree. How does that play into what you're doing at Discovery Institute?
Sure. So, I mean, looking back through like the history of one's life, you think about why did you do X, Y, or Z? At the time I went to law school, I thought I was going to do environmental law. I had a undergraduate and master's degree in earth sciences from UC San Diego, and living in Southern California, kind of an environmental law mecca. I thought combine those degrees with a law degree and I'd have a job for life. So that was my original plan. But then right as I was graduating, in the meantime, I got very involved with intelligent design activities, started a nonprofit that helps students to start student clubs on intelligent design on their college and high school campuses, and got to know a lot of the folks in the ID world. And so right as I was graduating from law school, got offered a job at Discovery Institute because I'd gotten to know them through my ID activities. And initially my role at Discovery actually was I was advising teachers on how to teach evolution objectively without getting into legal trouble. Most schools today basically require teachers to only teach the pro-Darwin only evidence and basically censor any scientific evidence that challenges Darwin. And so we would help, whether they were, educators or administrators or policymakers, to help them to teach evolution, the evidence for and against Darwin's theory without getting into legal trouble. So that was my first role at Discovery. And then also I would provide a lot of academic freedom defense for scientists who are being discriminated against because of their views supporting intelligent design. And we saw quite a few cases of those along those lines over the years. These days, I don't necessarily do a lot of practice of law in my job. We do have academic freedom cases that come up sometimes, and there are sort of public education policy issues that come up, and I do work on those. But mostly my role at Discovery Institute these days is I manage our research program. We have a very active research program funding scientists who are looking at the scientific evidence for intelligent design. And it's a lot of fun to work with those scientists and help them to investigate the evidence for design in nature. So my first academic love, Jacob, was always science. And so this is really what I prefer to be doing. Yeah.
It's so cool. I think it's just a really cool part of your background is law and science, and especially the way you're using it still to this day. I know, what I want to do in this podcast here is kind of have 3 segments, and the third segment will include some of your law experience. We will touch into that a little bit. But, I think I told you this before we started recording. I myself, and I'm in science. I'm a bioinformatics scientist. And for me personally, I always believed in Darwinian evolution, but merely because I was taught that, not because I thought it through. When I came across, Behe's book and your writings and Stephen C. Meyer's work, it just blew me away in a good way, because it made me see God in the science that I'm doing. So I'm really hoping for our listeners today, that's exactly what we can do, is show an intelligent designer in the science that is established. So just as a layout, what I first want to do is go over a basic overview of intelligent design. For those who don't know, maybe on a more elementary level, so we can get familiar with it, our listeners can. And then I'm going to push some objections to intelligent design to you from people that I know, from writings that I've seen on the internet and so forth. And then thirdly, we'll go over some practical tips. And this is straight from some of the youth folks in our local church. And I figured, well, who better to go to about this than Casey Luskin? So I've saved those for you. So the first question, just to clarify, what is Darwinian evolution? And I know people might be saying, oh, we came from chimps, but there's a little bit more to that. And maybe people haven't heard it since high school. So maybe just rehash, what is Darwinian evolution?
Sure. And actually, Darwinian evolution doesn't say we came from chimps. It says we share a common ancestor with chimps. I know you know all that, but yeah. So Darwinian evolution is a scientific view of how new species originate. That basically you have a population of organisms, and within that population, there's variation. Okay, some organisms might be able to run faster than others, or some organisms might be camouflaged, and because of those variations, some individuals in a population are better able to survive and reproduce than others. And over time, what will happen? The species will tend to evolve in the direction of those that are better able to survive and reproduce and leave more offspring, because those that leave more offspring, well, their offspring will dominate the population. So if you're in a population of gazelles and, there's cheetahs that are trying to attack you, spend a lot of time, in Africa, I've seen a few gazelles, I can tell you that. And you want to run away fast from the cheetahs. Well, guess what? Those gazelles that can run away faster are going to be able to better survive. And then they can obviously reproduce and leave offspring than the ones that run slower. So over time, you might see that population evolving towards faster and faster running gazelles. That's the basic idea. Now, that's sort of, very basic Darwinian evolution 101. But when we talk about the term evolution, it can really mean three main things, Jacob. And I'm sure you probably heard this before following Discovery Institute, but the first sort of definition of evolution is just change over time. Okay. We have change over time within a species. Look at the human species. We have different hair colors, eye colors, skin colors, body sizes, body types, etc. There's lots of variation within the human species, but we're all human beings. You could take people from anywhere on the planet, and if they were to marry and try to have a kid, they could have fertile offspring potentially. So we're all part of the same species, and there's been microevolution or small scale change within the human species. Nobody disagrees with this kind of evolution. It does not produce fundamentally new types of organisms, okay? The second type of evolution is what we would call common ancestry. That's the idea that all living organisms are related. So, of course, you and I are related, Jacob. You go back far enough, we'll find some common ancestor. You can do that with anybody in the human species. We're all related if you go back far enough. But common ancestry goes much further and says not only are all humans related, but all living organisms are related. If you go back far enough, then you would share a common ancestor with your pet cat or dog. Go back a little bit further, you'll share a common ancestor with the grass that's growing in your front yard. Go back even further and you will share a common ancestor with the fungus that's growing on the bottom of your foot. Okay, so all living organisms are related. So this idea of common ancestry, it's a part of what we would call macroevolution, the idea that we can have large-scale change from one type of organism evolving into another. Then the third definition of evolution is sort of getting to the mechanism of how does that change happen. And this is getting back to, Darwin's theory said that the main mechanism of evolution is natural selection. And then now that we know about DNA, the idea is that natural selection acts upon random mutations in our DNA. And some DNA mutations give organisms the better ability to survive and reproduce, and they will be selected because they leave more offspring. Okay. This is basically the mechanism of Darwin's theory, or neo-Darwinism as the modern theory of evolution is called. And it's important to understand this is a strictly blind and unguided mechanism. According to evolutionary biology, as it's taught in textbooks and practiced by evolutionary scientists, There is no intelligent agent who is guiding the evolutionary process. It happens on its own without any intelligent guidance, without any intelligent being who's overseeing it. It just happens. Okay. So this is supposed to be the magic of neo-Darwinism, is that all the grand diversity of life can be produced without any intelligent design whatsoever, simply by mutations in DNA arising, and then those mutations which are better, allowing organisms to survive and reproduce, get selected by natural selection. And that is supposed to explain basically, since the first organism, all the grand diversity that we see on life, plus a few other mechanisms like neutral evolution, symbiosis, et cetera. But it's all blind and unguided mechanisms all the way down, random mutation all the way down. There is no intelligent design according to standard evolutionary biology today.
So good. It's super helpful. And I'm glad you made the distinction between the different types of evolution, because the most frustrating thing I deal with as a Christian and an apologist at the same time is, well, you don't believe in evolution? I can't believe that. And it's like, well, slow down. It's not that I don't believe in evolution. It's the kind of evolution that we're talking about. So I'm really glad you made that distinction. And for our listeners, our Christian listeners, I recommend you do the same in your discussions about evolution, because we do all agree in microevolution. That's evident, but it's the macro where it gets complicated. So that's really helpful. Now, since you did that, now can you define intelligent design for us? Give us an overview, what it is. Just give us an overview of intelligent design.
Yeah, intelligent design is a scientific theory which says that many features of nature, in life and in the universe, are best explained by an intelligent cause, rather than that sort of undirected mechanism, something like natural selection being an unguided, undirected mechanism. And the reason that we say that intelligent design is the best explanation is because we're finding in nature features which have the kind of information and complexity, which in our experience always comes from intelligence. Okay. So I'll give you some very, very basic examples of this. And Jacob, you're a biologist, so this is going to be very, very simple and basic for you. But if we look at what is at the heart of life, okay, what is at the very essence of the cell? What we see in our DNA is a language-based code. We see these nucleotide bases along the backbone of the DNA, which are arranged in very precise orders in order to encode all the information necessary to build the proteins in your body, okay, and many other things in your body. So what we see in our DNA is a language-based code that encodes information, which is what we would call in the ideal world complex and specified. It's complex, meaning that it's an unlikely sequence, and it's specified, meaning that it matches a pattern. So in our DNA, we see an unlikely sequence of these nucleotide bases that matches up the exact pattern that is necessary to produce a functional protein. We've funded research here at Discovery Institute into just how precisely ordered do the nucleotide bases in our DNA have to be to generate functional proteins. And one study found that for an enzyme of typical complexity, that only 1 in every 10 to the 77 sequences of amino acids will give you a functional protein. Okay, so that's a very unlikely sequence that is specified to match the exact pattern necessary for a protein to work properly. Okay, so again, what we see at the heart of life in our DNA is information stored in a language-based code. Now, it's not enough to just have that information in your DNA. Just having a DNA molecule is kind of like just having a DVD. You remember when we used to watch DVDs and before we had streaming and all that? So if you just have a DVD, it's really not good for anything. I mean, maybe you could use it as a coffee coaster or as a Frisbee or something, but you need machinery to read the information on the DVD and give you some kind of a useful output. Well, DNA works exactly the same way. Our DNA literally contains computer-like commands and instructions, and your cells have machinery that can read that instruction. They're called molecular machines that can read the instructions in your DNA, interpret those instructions through a form of computer-like information processing, and then execute those instructions. And what is the process of this computer-like information processing? Well, your cells are producing molecular machines that are literally running around your cells, performing all kinds of important functions. So what we see at the heart of life is language-based code in our DNA, and then computer-like information processing that reads and interprets that code to produce machines. But where in our experience do things like language-based code come from? Computer information processing come from? or machine-like structures. In all of our experience, these things come only from intelligence. So this kind of gets back to what I said earlier. What we see in nature is the kind of information and complexity which in our experience always comes from intelligence. And so that's why we would say that intelligent design is the best explanation for what we see at the heart of life.
So good. And that you mentioned my biology background, and earlier I said how intelligent design has helped me see God in the science. And it's exactly that, the coding behind it. And in my line of work, I'm a bioinformatics scientist, so we literally all day we spend coding and looking at probability metrics, and we're applying mathematics to the biological realm. To me, it's fascinating because if it were unguided and chaotic, I would find it very hard to get any reliable output. But we're getting really great, significant results that prove to be significant when the patient is treated for cancer or whatever it may be. So it's really intelligent design. The whole field is incredible. I think it's needed and necessary, and that's why we're having this conversation, to get it out there even more. But I want you to, if you can, differentiate intelligent design with creationism, because I think too many times the two get conflated.
Sure. So creationism is a religious viewpoint that starts with some particular interpretation of the Bible, for example, and then tries to say, this is how you fit the Bible with science. And creationism always will explicitly refer to, basically God, the God of the Bible, or some supernatural divine being as the creator, of everything. It will explicitly identify the designer as God, Yahweh, Allah, whoever you might think, the designer is. But it's getting into those kinds of very religious questions about who the designer is. So that's different from intelligent design. Intelligent design doesn't start with a religious text. It starts with the evidence that we see in nature. What can we learn from the scientific evidence? And do we see evidence for an intelligent designer being responsible for many aspects of life in the universe? And then intelligent design doesn't try, as a science, it doesn't try to speculate about some of those larger religious questions like, well, what is the identity of the designer? But we have supporters in the intelligent design community who are Christians, of course, but also folks who are Muslims or Jews or folks from a Hindu persuasion or folks who maybe are agnostic about who the designer is. We have folks from many different diverse backgrounds in the ID world. And that's because intelligent design as a science doesn't get into some of those larger religious questions about who the designer is. It's simply saying, look, we can see from the scientific evidence that there is a need for an intelligent cause, a mind to be responsible for many of the things that we see. These things don't come about through blind, unguided, chance-based mechanisms. You require an intelligence to basically design and make these features, these complex features we're seeing. So intelligent design is not necessarily against creationism, and there's different forms of creationism. Of course, the most common view would be that the interpretation of Genesis, which says that God created everything about 6 to 10,000 years ago in 6 24-hour days. That's young Earth creationism. Then there's old Earth creationism, which would say that, yes, again, they believe that Genesis is the word of God and that God created everything in 6 maybe periods of time or something like that. Different ways of interpreting the book of Genesis. And they would allow for basically a very ancient, maybe billions of year old Earth. Both views are different ways that Christians and actually Jews as well, and other people who believe in the Bible, will interpret the book of Genesis and try to reconcile science and the Bible. Intelligent design has no problem with people trying to do that. I mean, if you want to try to figure out the best way to fit the Bible with science, that's fine. I mean, I'm a Christian myself, and I've had to wrestle with these things. Intelligent design is just focused on a different project. It's not so much asking, how do we fit the Bible with science, but whether there is scientific evidence that points using intelligent scientific evidence to an intelligent cause being responsible for what we see in nature. So kind of very different approaches. Creationism starts with the Bible. Intelligent science starts with the scientific data. Creationism ends with religious conclusions. Ends with scientific conclusions. So just a different approach.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, if Christianity were true, it should line up with the scientific evidence. Now, the scientific evidence can be flawed, and there's some, discernment that we have to make there. But I think there's no, the strong creationist might say, oh, but you're leaving out the Bible. But it's more like a natural theology, like Thomas Aquinas said, that we're doing. We're looking at the general revelation of God to point back to a creator. We're looking at the effect to point back to the cause.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I'm a Christian. I don't ever try to hide that. In fact, everybody in the ID community that I know has been very open about their personal theological views. Whether they're a Christian, we have Christians, we have Jews, we have folks who are Muslims, we have agnostics. Everybody, to a man or a woman, is very open about, their own views on those bigger questions. They just make it clear that these, my view that the God of the Bible is the designer does not come from intelligent design. It comes from any other, good apologetic arguments that go beyond intelligent design or apart from that, and also my own personal experience. But as a Christian, what I would cite, getting to what you just said, Jacob, verses like Romans 1:20, which say that God is clearly seen in what has been made. So, from my Christian perspective, the Bible actually predicts that we will see evidence in nature for a creator, for an intelligent being that made everything. Okay. Now, that is obviously a religious verse that's predicting that. But lo and behold, I can go out and do science and come to the same conclusion. And so I think that intelligent design is very consistent with, a biblical view of Romans 1:20, which says we'll find evidence for a designer and a divine creator even behind nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really pushing back against that naturalistic, you could even say materialistic mindset that really has been on the onset since like the scientific revolution. So, and it's needed, especially in the scientific realm. There's so many materialists, though I will say there's a lot of New Agers I'm seeing a lot in the scientific realm. So that's a little interesting twist. But what I want to dive into now is the evidence within ID. So intelligent design, ID. I know there's irreducible complexity and specified complexity. Can you break those two down?
Sure. Maybe we could start with specified complexity. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Specified complexity, also called complex and specified information, is the kind of information which in our experience always comes from an intelligent mind. Okay. So what does that mean? So something is complex if it's unlikely, and it's specified if it matches an independent pattern. Okay. So right now, the vibrations that are coming out of my voice box and that you're hearing through the microphone, it's a very, very unlikely movement of air molecules. Okay. So it's very, very complex, yet it matches a pattern that you immediately recognize as conforming to the English language. So this would be a form of specified and something that's both specified and complex. But let's think about having just a bag of dirt. Okay. You go out in your front yard, you pick up a bag of dirt. Okay. There's a lot of different kinds of things in that bag. All right. There's a lot of very, very unusual molecules, broken down minerals, plant bits, probably, bits of DNA from animals and droppings and all kinds of stuff that's in that bag of dirt. Okay. And, from a geologist's perspective, all kinds of broken down rock bits in that dirt. It's a very, very complex mixture of dirt. Very, very unlikely to get that exact mixture in that bag. All right. But what's the pattern? There's no pattern there, right? It's just a sort of random mixture. You're not going to say, oh, this bag of dirt was intelligently designed. No, you just went into your yard and you picked up a bag of dirt. Nobody designed it to be exactly what's in that bag. And so you're not going to detect design. It's complex, but it's not specified. Okay. Or think of a salt crystal. Okay. A salt crystal, like sodium chloride, it has a long repeating NaCl, sodium chlorine sequence of atoms. Think back to your high school chemistry class. My wife teaches high school chemistry. So, we talk about these kinds of things. So a salt crystal has a pattern. Okay. There is a repeating pattern of sodium chloride over and over again, millions of these atoms over and over again repeating, but it's not complex. It's not actually an unlikely feature. If you have the right chemicals and you have them under the right conditions, you will form a sodium chloride salt crystal. Okay. It's guaranteed to happen because of the laws of nature and the ways that chemical bonding work. Okay. So it's not a complex or unlikely feature. It's specified, but it's not complex. So again, we don't detect design just because we found a salt crystal. This happens naturally on its own. Doesn't need an intelligent designer. So intelligent design is looking for things that are both complex and specified. And in our experience, when we find complex and specified information, it's design. I'll give you one last example. Okay. Think of going to a mountain. My favorite mountain around the Seattle area where we live is Mount Rainier. Huge, big volcano. hiked up there many, many times over the years. Beautiful mountain. And when we fly out of Seattle, a lot of times the pilots will, if they're going that direction, they will give you a little buzz tour of Mount Rainier and you get a nice photograph of it from the plane. So it has a very unlikely shape, all right? The likelihood of Mount Rainier having the exact shape that it does, all the contours and everything is very, very low. But again, it's not specified to match a pattern. But what if you go to Mount Rushmore? Mount Rushmore also has a very unlikely shape, but it matches a pattern, the faces of 4 famous presidents. So you immediately can recognize that Mount Rushmore was designed. So this is complex and specified information. The more you think about it, the more you won't be able to stop thinking about it. And you'll realize it's a really useful way to understand. We use this method of reasoning, looking for complexity and specification to detect design all the time, every day, without even thinking about it. And don't let me go on for too long here, Jacob, but let's say you're driving down a road and you see some paint on the road, okay? And that paint spells out the words railroad X-ing, crossing, okay? Without even thinking about it, you realize that was put there by an intelligent agent to send you a message to stop at those railroad tracks, okay? So you make a design inference, you stop, and that may be important to save your life from a train going by. But why did you see that? Well, you saw the paint on the ground without even thinking about it. You intuitively realized this is unlikely, okay, that this would happen by chance, and it matches a pattern that I recognize. So I can see that an intelligent agent is responsible for this. Now, what if you went down the road and you saw a very, very weirdly shaped splotch of white paint, all right? You would say, you might think, okay, that's an unlikely splotch of paint, but it doesn't mean anything. There's no pattern there. So you're probably going to think that some poor, painter was driving down the road and a can of paint fell off his truck or her truck and blew up on the ground and just left a big splotch of paint. Okay. So you did not detect design without even thinking about it. You thought, okay, unlikely, but no pattern here. Nothing for me to think there's a designer trying to send me a message or communicate something. So I'm just going to keep on driving. So you don't stop. Hopefully there's no railroad track and hopefully you don't die, but so we make design inferences like this using this kind of method of reasoning all the time, and we don't even realize it. So that's specified complexity. You also asked about irreducible complexity. Oh, and in biology, getting back to proteins, okay? When we have that very, very unlikely sequence of nucleotides that is just the exactly right pattern to give you a functional protein, that's specified complexity. Because again, unlikely sequence matches the pattern needed for a functional protein. So we see very high complex and specified information throughout our DNA. Now, irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity is actually kind of a special set, a special type of specified complexity. And this was an idea that was coined by Michael Behe. You mentioned the book Darwin's Black Box, Jacob. That actually, you and I have this in common. That was actually the book that got me into intelligent design. Okay, I read that book after my freshman year of college. I've been taking all these courses in evolutionary biology, and I was thinking, okay, how do all these complex features evolve? And I wasn't really like my freshman year rudimentary way of thinking hadn't really figured very much out yet. But I read that book after my freshman year, and I felt like Michael Behe was putting into words what my brain was trying to wrap its head around. That there were just no explanations for how these complex features evolve in living organisms. So Michael Behe coined the term irreducible complexity. And it's basically a system that is composed of many well-matched parts, where if you remove any one part from that system, then it no longer works. So if you reduce the complexity, it stops functioning. So the complexity is irreducible, okay? And what Behe argues in that book is that there are many natural structures in biology, things like molecular machines, biochemical pathways, that are irreducibly complex. If you take away one enzyme from that biochemical pathway, it stops working. If you take away one part from this molecular machine in a cell, it no longer functions. And so what Behe would argue is that these molecular machines that are irreducibly complex, they require a certain core level of complexity to be present before they will even function to give you some advantage in surviving and reproducing, okay? So Darwin's theory says that you have to evolve features one tiny little mutational step at a time. Okay, I think there's this famous quote in Origin of Species where he says that if any organ cannot be formed by numerous successive slight modifications, then my theory would absolutely break down. And Michael Behe would argue that these irreducibly complex features that we see in biology, they cannot be formed by numerous successive slight modifications. They're kind of like an all or nothing game. Either at least some, minimal threshold of complexity is there and it works, or it's not there and it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, then natural selection has no reason to preserve that structure and to help that thing to evolve. So it's basically too unlikely for an irreducibly complex feature to evolve by getting all those parts there all at once that are necessary for it to function. And so Behe would cite examples like molecular machines like the bacterial flagellum. The bacterial flagellum is a molecular machine that bacteria use to swim around. It's kind of like an outboard motor with this little tail or propeller that spins to help them swim around in a liquid medium to find food. Behe would argue, and I think that there's good evidence from genetic knockout experiments, that the flagellum requires at least 20 plus protein parts to be present or it won't work. So by definition, it is irreducibly complex. Another example that he cites is the blood clotting cascade. You prick your finger and you start to bleed, but lo and behold, a couple minutes go by and it stops, hopefully, if you don't have hemophilia, right? So it turns out that, actually we can come back to that. It turns out that blood clotting requires a certain core number of enzymes to be there in order for it to work. And you can do knockout experiments. In fact, hemophiliacs have a disorder with one of their clotting factors, which prevents their blood from clotting properly. And you can do knockouts on mice or other organisms. And if they don't have these necessary clotting factors, the certain core parts of this blood clotting pathway present, then they can't clot blood and they will die if they get cut or something like that. So, or something bad will happen to them. So blood clotting is another example of irreducible complexity. So there's many examples of this. And Michael Behe would argue that not only is irreducible complexity, now I'd agree with this, is it a challenge to the neo-Darwinian mechanism of random mutation and natural selection, it also is positive evidence for intelligent design. Because where in our experience do we see these purposeful arrangement of parts coming together to produce machines? And of all of our experience, when we see a bunch of parts coming together towards some goal to form a machine, it always traces back to a mind or an intelligence. So we see intelligent design in irreducible complexity. So yeah, great. I'm glad you're asking these very, very basic questions, but these are really foundational to how we detect design and how we think about intelligent design. So really, really great questions, Jacob.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to share these with our listeners because I think irreducible complexity and specified complexity are two that really blew me away because you're right, it's intuitive. I mean, you see things on the street, you see signs, and you see that's a person, someone intelligent put that there. It's kind of like looking for life outside of the universe or in different planets, and we get these like slight sounds or repetitive vibrations, and we say, "Oh, that's sign of intelligence." So we're doing the same thing. We're looking for specified complexity. The follow-up question that came to mind as you were speaking on both irreducible and specified complexity would be, did Darwin himself have this type of knowledge when he was coming up with his theory? Or is it something that came after and maybe needs some type of revision for the Darwinian evolution theory?
Great question, Jacob. In fairness to Darwin, in his day, they did not understand the complexity of the cell. I mean, we can only speculate what Darwin would have said if he knew about the complexity of the cell that we understand today. So I'm not going to even go there. But we do know that in Darwin's day, there were contemporaries of Darwin who thought that the cell was kind of like a little simple glob of protoplasm. They didn't really think that it had, all these complexities. So what Michael Behe in his book, why did he call his book Darwin's Black Box? Because he said, look, for Darwin, the cell was like a black box. He did not understand that there were all these molecular machines, enzymes, protein, DNA carrying information, that cells are like miniature factories taking information from DNA, building proteins. They have all kinds of other organelles that make them almost like a miniature city. There are waste disposal systems. There are recycling systems. There are energy production systems. There are information processing systems. There are gates and smart active gates that keep bad things out and let good things in. It's like a miniature city with factories inside, but far, far more complex. I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say, Jacob, that the most complicated human technology ever devised really doesn't even compare to the simplest bacterial cell. Okay, there's stuff going on in the simplest cell that we don't even understand. So the cell is extremely complex. Now, Darwin did understand that it would have been possible in principle for biological features to exist that his theory couldn't produce. And that's why that quote about, he said, if an organ cannot be produced by numerous successive slight modifications, then his theory would absolutely break down. Now, Darwin went on to say that he knew of no such case. All right. He didn't know of any organ that sort of met his challenge. But that was, in 1859 or whatever. Right. So science come a long way since then. And Michael Behe would say that now that we have opened up the black box of the cell, we realize that it's full of these molecular machines, miniaturized factories, smart, intelligently operating, logic circuits that control how things operate. He would say that no, this is definitely the kind of complexity that Darwin said could not evolve by his mechanism. So that's what ID would argue, that we have more than met Darwin's challenge. And today, the complexity we understand in the cell could not evolve by Darwinian mechanisms.
Yeah, it reminds me of kind of what Jonathan Wells, I know you guys at Discovery Institute have talked about him a lot. He passed recently. But he, his work on the icon of Darwin, is that what he termed it as?
Or icons of evolution, yeah.
Icon of evolution, because they stick with this Darwinian theory when really it's somewhat outdated to what we now know about biology in the cell. But it's still firmly stated and believed and taught, and it's a weird commitment, I think, that is afraid to revise and look back on. So that's really, it's good to know for our listeners. This is kind of thrown in there because it's kind of more recent. It came about recently. But before we get to the objections to ID, typically, the pro-evolution argument that we learned in school, that Bill Nye, the science guy, would always tell me on TV and whatnot, is that we share approximately 98.8% of our DNA with chimpanzees and a difference of about 1.2%. I've heard you, I've read your articles, I've listened to your podcast, but I think it needs to be said for our listeners, this new study that came out pretty much refuting that. So can you detail what this study said and showed?
Sure. So yeah, exactly, Jacob. I'm sure that your listeners have heard many times that that our genomes are 99 or 98% similar to those of chimps. And I actually don't really think that the percent genetic similarity that we have to chimps really is all that important for determining questions about common ancestry or evolution. It could be common ancestry, whatever the percent similarity is, whether it's, people say we're 50% banana. Okay, fine, whatever. I don't think that's true, but it could be the result of common ancestry, but it could also be the result of common design, where designers will reuse parts that work in different designs. I mean, human designers do this all the time. Human designers will reuse wheels on both cars and airplanes, or reuse keyboards on both cell phones and tablets, or programmers will reuse code in different programs they're writing. So it's not weird that we share functional DNA, a lot of it, with chimpanzees. It just shows we're built upon a common blueprint through common design. Okay, fine. But nonetheless, evolutionists have really used this 98.8% statistic that we're 98.8% genetically similar to a chimp as an argument for common ancestry. You mentioned Bill Nye. He's argued that. Smithsonian Institution Museum in Washington, D.C., it uses the argument that we're 98.8% similar to chimps, genetically speaking, as an argument for common ancestry. We've all heard this, okay? So they're making this argument. So clearly for them, it's a big deal. Our percent genetic similarity, it's an icon of evolution. So this paper came out in Nature last month in April of 2025 that for the first time sequenced the complete ape genomes, okay? And what they basically showed is that there are many sections of the chimp and human genomes that just don't align because they are too different, okay? There might be different copies of different numbers of copies of repetitive DNA, or the sequences are just completely different. Or you might have just single nucleotides that are different as you move along the chromosomes. And if you add up the different types of differences that they found in this study, it adds up to about 85 to 86% genetically similar between humans and chimps. So basically, we'll call that 14 to 15% different, genetically speaking, between humans and chimps. So that's, more than an order of magnitude greater a difference than that 1% statistic that we're commonly told, that we're only 1.2, whatever percent different from a chimpanzee. You're just basically a barely modified chimp. No, that's not true. The DNA, this new Nature paper that did the complete sequence of the ape genomes, chimps, orangutans, and gorillas, found that compared to chimps, we are basically about 15% genetically different. So this is a huge story, and I think it's very important for people to know, that what they've been taught maybe isn't true.
Yeah, and if the pro-evolutionist is going to bank so heavily on the percentage of shared DNA, and as you mentioned, that we don't have to even refute that because we could say that it could be common design, and I think that's fantastic. It's quick and easy. But if they're going to add that much weight to it to show common ancestry, then this should really be problematic to them because now you can't just fall back on it and say, oh, it never really mattered to begin with. Now you have to come up with an explanation as to why we're seeing different results. So I think it does put the ball in their court. I'm excited to see, if they haven't already, what they come up with in response to this study. So objections to ID. I think this is important. Interestingly, Casey, I was not able to find too many scientific objections. A lot of it was philosophical in nature. For instance, the first argument, I do have one scientific for you, but the first philosophical one is, isn't this just God of the gaps when we posit in a designer?
Yeah. So great point you're making there, Jacob. That does come up a lot. People will say that intelligent design is just a God of the gaps argument. What do they mean by that? Well, what they're saying is that there's certain things that science doesn't know yet. And they're saying that basically you are just inserting God or intelligent designer into the gaps in our knowledge. Okay. But someday science is always discovering new things. Science is going to solve those problems. And so therefore, you should not be making this argument. And the way that basically the thrust of what they're saying is that intelligent design is just an argument from ignorance, is based upon what we don't know, what science has not yet discovered, and we're inserting God into that gap in our knowledge. The problem is that intelligent design is not an argument from ignorance. It's not based upon what we don't know. It's based upon what we do know. We do know that there are certain kinds of complexity, namely, complex and specified information, irreducibly complex machines, and all of our experience, those kinds of things always trace back to a mind or a personal agent. So we're not making an argument based upon what we don't know. We're making an argument based upon what we do know, that information, language-based code always comes from a mind. And so this is not a God of the gaps argument. It's an intelligence of what we observe and experience in the world around us argument. And this is very much, I think the God of the gaps argument really just fundamentally misunderstands how the argument for intelligent design works.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, the naturalist will say, or the pro-evolutionist will say, oh, like you said, oh, we'll find out given enough time, or naturalism or science will figure it out. That's naturalism in the gaps. It's the same thing, just different objects. So we're really not making much progress here. So I like how you put it. We're going based on what we do know, not what we don't know. So I think that addresses that just fine. The next objection I hear so commonly, I know our listeners probably do too. Doesn't the fossil record show evidence of evolution? And this may lead into a conversation about Lucy. So I'm happy for you to just go on a rant about both of those.
Sure. So yeah, you do hear that argument. People think, oh, evolution is supported by fossils. Okay. Well, when you talk about the fossil record, what are you talking about? If you're talking about, yes, 3 billion years ago, all we had in the fossil record were basically bacteria. And today we have all kinds of complex animals. So in a very general sense, yes, things did get more complicated over time. But what neo-Darwinism predicts is that what we should see in the fossil record are these transitional forms, which document one type of organism evolving into another. Okay. And yes, occasionally we do find fossils that might be potential transitional forms. But by and large, the pattern that we see in the fossil record is that new types of organisms appear abruptly in what paleontologists call explosions. And these explosions of life are found throughout the fossil record, where new types of organisms appear very rapidly without any direct evolutionary precursors. Okay. The most famous example of this is the Cambrian explosion. There's a bunch of examples, but the most famous one is the Cambrian explosion, where basically most of the major groups of animals appear abruptly in the Cambrian period without any direct evolutionary ancestors. I think Richard Dawkins, famous evolutionary biologist, has this great quote where he says about the Cambrian animals, he says it's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Okay, that's Dawkins saying that, okay? So it's really extraordinary, the degree that of sort of abrupt appearance of new types of organisms. There's another explosion later when it comes to plants. Land plants appear explosively in the fossil record. Then flowering plants appear later in the Cretaceous in a very explosive manner. It's been called the big bloom of life. There is an explosion of many major bird groups in the late Cretaceous, early Tertiary. And then in the early Tertiary, we see a mammal explosion where most major groups of mammals appear abruptly. So what we see in the fossil record is not this gradualistic pattern that was predicted by Darwin's theory or even neo-Darwinism. What we see is the more common pattern are abrupt explosions. Now, there are a few fossils that are occasionally cited as potential transitional forms, and most of them end up going, sort of belly up when you explore them in greater detail. And we could talk about Lucy if you want. There's other ones as well. But Lucy is supposed to be a transitional form leading from sort of our ape-like Australopithecine ancestors to ultimately to our genus Homo. We are the species Homo sapiens. Homo, that means wise man in Latin. We're genus Homo, species sapien. And so Lucy is supposed to be a direct ancestor of our genus Homo. The problem with this whole argument is that when you look at the paleoanthropology fossil record, there is an abrupt gap. There is a major break in the fossil record between ape-like species like Lucy and human-like species like some of the earliest members of the genus Homo, such as Homo erectus or Neanderthals. Okay, so and I can give you quotes on this. Ernst Mayr, a very famous evolutionary biologist, he said the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecus by a large unbridged gap. By the way, Lucy was the species Australopithecus afarensis, and the Australopithecines are supposed to be an ape-like genus of hominids that are directly ancestral to our genus Homo. But listen to what Mayr is saying. Again, the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecus by a large unbridged gap. He goes on to say, how can we explain this seeming saltation? Saltation means a jump. He says, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links, we have to fall back on the time-honored method of historical science, the construction of a historical narrative. I mean, I could give you many other quotes from the mainstream literature to that effect. But the bottom line is that there is a major break in the fossil record between the Australopithecines, who are very ape-like, and the earliest members of the genus Homo, which are actually very human-like. Now, Lucy in particular is said to be special or important because they think that she had a very chimpanzee-like head on top of a very human-like body. There was kind of like this bipedal upright walking species that had a very chimp-like small-brained head. Okay, so imagine a little ape-like creature that's walking around a lot like you and me. The problem with that interpretation of Lucy is that there's been a lot of doubts raised that she really was bipedal, or at least habitually bipedal. For one, there's one study that said that she had hand bones like those of a knuckle walker. Okay, there's also evidence from her pelvis that Lucy's pelvis actually had a very chimp-like shape originally. Okay, a pelvis that would have been more suited probably for quadrupedal type walking rather than bipedal. And there have been some basically, I think what it comes down to is we don't have a good enough idea of what Lucy's pelvis was like to make an idea of exactly how she walked. But the big bone that's cited for Lucy is her knee. And it said that Lucy's knee joint is that of an upright walking species. And you can make that case. However, if you think about the angle, if you're standing upright, you'll notice that your femur kind of points down and in towards the middle from your hips. Okay. There's an angle there called the bicondylar angle. Lucy's femurs would actually have pointed in towards the center even more, much more than the human being femur does. So whatever was going on there with Lucy, it was very different from the way human beings walk with our knees and our legs. Okay. And Lucy also had very long arms, very sort of ape-like, long, strong arms, probably was very good for climbing in trees. A lot of people have said that she was very well suited for a tree dwelling or arboreal lifestyle. So again, that's not human being type of locomotion, type of walking, right? So what we see in Lucy is a mixture of traits that she could do knuckle walking. She spent a lot of time in trees, and she probably had some limited capability for upright walking. But I think that bicondylar angle probably is best suited for like walking on tree branches. Okay. For you're like walking, putting one foot in front of the other, your knees are going to kind of be pointing in very sharply from your pelvis as you do that. Well, that's kind of how Lucy walked. Okay. And so I think that when Lucy was walking, think of her with her long arms, grasping tree branches, walking on tree branches. I think that's the kind of upright walking that she was doing. It was not upright walking like we do. So Lucy was great for what she did. But had one study, by the way, said that when Lucy died, she died because she fell out of a tree. So she spent a lot of time in trees. Probably not the funnest way to die. But I think that what we see with Lucy is a species that was very different from humans and had a mode of locomotion that was very different from modern humans. Yes, some limited upright walking, but not in the same way a habitual biped like we are. And so that's Lucy. I mean, we can talk about other species if you want, but I think that a strong case can be made that, she was great for what she was designed to do, but there's not a good case for her being a human ancestor.
Yeah, it's super helpful. I think, as you were talking about the fossil record and Lucy, I just keep thinking like you really, as a pro-evolutionist, and maybe to no fault of their own, you really have to go into looking at this evidence, assuming or presupposing that Darwinian evolution is true to reach that conclusion as confidently as you do, because you could look at, common ancestry, the shared DNA with the completely different perspective and get a equally reasonable conclusion. And same with Lucy being, a tree species and the fossil record having so many gaps, it's easy to overlook that if you're just looking for evidence for your Darwinian evolution for you. So it's really good to clarify that. And for our listeners, I think push back a little bit on that. It's good to engage in these conversations. But
yeah, I mean,
I don't
what do they say about Lucy having the hand bones of a knuckle walker? They will interpret that as saying, well, maybe one of Lucy's ancestors knuckle walked, but they will reinterpret it saying, oh, but that was just a primitive retention from her ancestors. Kind of like people will say, we don't need our appendix anymore. That was used by our ancestors. That's not true, by the way. The appendix is very important as a storehouse for good bacteria, probiotics. Okay. But that's another story. But, they would say that this was just a leftover from her ancestors. Okay. You can interpret that if you want that way, but that's more like explaining away the data than explaining the data. I think if she had the hand bones for a knuckle walker, then that's probably a piece of evidence that tells you how she walked, at least some of the time. So there you go.
Right. Yeah. It's important the lens at which you look at the evidence. I'm not going to leave you without a scientific objection, though. I was able to find one interesting one, and this is regarding co-option. And does it adequately explain as an alternative theory for irreducible complexity? I found this one quote from, and I might pronounce his last name wrong, Nicholas Matsky. Are you familiar with him? Maybe.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
He's a well-known ID critic. Yeah.
Okay, good. So he said this quote about co-option and to refute Behe's flagellum example. And he said this, there is a strong, he lists 4 reasons why this view works. There's a strong possibility, previously unrecognized, of further homologies between the type 3 export apparatus of F1, F0 ATP synthesis. Much of the flagellum's complexity evolved after crude motility was in place via internal gene duplications and sub-functionalization. Only one major system-level change of function and 4 minor shifts of function need to be invoked to explain the origin of the flagellum. This involves 5 subsystem-level co-option events. For this transition between each stage is bridgeable by the evolution of a single new binding site, coupling 2 pre-existing subsystems, followed by co-evolutionary optimization of components. Therefore, like the eye contemplated by Darwin, careful analysis shows that there are no major obstacles to gradual evolution of the flagellum. So for our listeners, that probably sounds like a different language. Maybe you could rehash what he's saying, but what would you say in response to the co-option objection to irreducible complexity?
Sure. So there's no way to go through everything you just said. And actually, you didn't even
Yeah.
get into a lot of the details of what he's saying, what's wrong with it. Some of these steps, these alleged parts that could be co-opted into the flagellum are nothing like flagellar parts. So they can't be co-opted as easily as he's saying that. I'm familiar with the paper that you're talking about there. But let's take one of the examples that he gives. He says that something called the type 3 secretion system could have been a system that could have been co-opted to become part of the flagellum. Okay. So what does co-option mean? Co-option basically means that you are taking other systems that are in the cell and you are retooling them, changing them, and suddenly recombining these systems to create a completely functional new system. Okay. So you're basically borrowing parts from other systems. It would be like saying you want to build a laptop. Okay. So what do? Well, you take the power cord from your toaster, you take the monitor from your TV, you take the hard drive from your old desktop computer, you take the keyboard from your typewriter, and you retool all these parts together, and suddenly you got a laptop. Well, yeah, you can see similarities between those parts and other systems. By the way, that could be the result of common design, not necessarily common descent, but you can see the similarities between these parts, but that doesn't mean that those parts are easily interchangeable, where you can just swap them in and out from one system to another, and suddenly give yourself an entirely new system. It doesn't work like that. So it turns out, for example, that the type 3 secretion system is, it's kind of like, think of an outboard motor, okay? I did a lot of boating with my family growing up, and I still love to do boating. You put an outboard motor on the back of your boat, you need to attach it to your boat, okay? Well, this type 3 secretion system in the flagellum kind of functions like the attachment, the bracket that you attach the flagellar motor in the bacterial cell membrane with, okay? Kind of like the anchor, it anchors it in the cell membrane. It also can do these really complicated, important function of helping to export proteins outside the cell so that then you can assemble the flagellum, all right? So what people will say was maybe the type 3 secretion system, which is another system known in biology, maybe the flagellar sort of anchor body was borrowed from the type 3 secretion system. Well, there's a problem with this argument, and that is that this type 3 secretion system is known from this bacterial organelle that is thought to have evolved very, very late in the history of life. Okay, it's only found in a very narrow subset of bacteria, whereas flagella are distributed among many, many diverse types of bacteria. Okay, you ask a complex question, you're going to get a complex answer.
I appreciate it.
You're following, yeah. So if you think about the bacterial phylogeny, according to evolution, flagella, which are very widely distributed among many bacterial phyla, they should be very deep. They should have originated very, very early in bacterial evolutionary history. You know, this is from an evolutionary perspective and not late. Yet the type 3 secretion system is found only in a very narrow subset of bacteria. So it's thought to evolve much later, which actually makes sense because what is the flagellum used to do? It's used to help bacteria swim around to find food. That's something you're going to need really, really early on in, the history of bacteria. I mean, you're going to need them immediately, really. Bacteria are going to need flagella in order to find food very, very, very early. But the type 3 secretory system is actually used by this very, very special type of unique predatory bacteria that eat eukaryotes. Now, eukaryotes are very, very advanced types of cells. We're eukaryotes. They're very, very advanced organisms that are, again, thought to have arisen much later in the history of life. So everything we know about the type 3 secretion system suggests that it arose very late in the history of life, whereas everything we know about the flagellum suggests it arose very early. So there's no way you could have co-opted the type 3 secretory system when you were trying to evolve the flagellum, because it, as far as the best evidence shows, it didn't exist yet. All right. Mm-hmm. So these co-option stories, they might look good on paper, but they really fall apart when you look into the details. And by the way, don't look into the details because you're never going to get details of how all these different parts suddenly spontaneously come together and make a new system. And this is really the catch-22 of co-option, okay? Because either co-option models, everything just looks like it was set up to evolve into this new system, in which case they tend to look very, very designed. The word we use is teleological, like it was kind of preordained, or the evolutionary pathway doesn't work very well, and they're too different to actually serve as sort of the systems that you can borrow. I mean, I think Nick Matzke talks about borrowing a kind of a pilus to form the bacterial propeller, the filament. And these are totally different systems. And I don't see how we can say that just changing a couple binding sites is going to convert a pilus into a bacterial flagellar filament. It's just, these are very, very different systems. So sometimes it's like he's counting on so much luck, it starts to sound really suspicious. And other times it's like, no, man, luck is not going to do that for you. So I'm not aware of any successfully peer-reviewed, published, detailed explanation for the co-option origin of anything in biology. Okay. People have used that term. They've thrown it around here and there, but I've never heard them actually explain how a system evolved via co-option. And so it's a nice idea, but lacking details. I think right now it's just an idea. And so I love this quote by two ID theorists that I work with, Bill Dembski and Jonathan Witt. And they basically say, what in our experience can take machines and then retool them, recombine their parts into new, irreducibly complex machines? Basically, what can do this co-option? They say, well, there's only one thing that can do that, and that's intelligence. So if co-option really is happening, I think it's more of an argument for design than anything else.
I 100% agree. I had to look into that quote in that paper a lot more, but as I was reading, I just kept thinking common design would explain this, a designer would explain this. So again, it's that lens, and I'm happy you clarified that for our listeners. And if our listeners got overwhelmed by the scientific lingo, I apologize, but it needs to be said. I have one more. I have a lot of questions for you actually, but one more given our time limit here. And this is a practical question, so pretty more law related. And this came from someone in our youth group at our church, and she's a high school teacher, and she teaches in science, but she's in a public school and told to teach Darwinian evolution. But given her Christian faith, seems a rock in a hard place with what to teach. And do you teach it as a fact? Do you teach it as a theory? So how would you recommend she go about proceeding with this direction from the curriculum? Does she bring up intelligent design? What would you recommend?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to give legal advice, to a specific person, a specific situation. If she, and actually, we don't even give legal advice. We give just practical curricular advice, which we think is the best way to teach this scientifically, objectively, and all of that. So if your friend actually wants to reach out and contact us at Discovery, we could help her work through whatever her situation is. And there may be some resources we could point her to. But generally speaking, what we recommend for public school teachers, and I don't know if she's in public schools or not, but generally what we recommend, is that actually teachers don't get into intelligent design. Our priority with intelligent design is to see it grow and develop as a science. And this has been our priority for many years. And we're having a lot of success. We've seen, hundreds of peer-reviewed pro-ID scientific research papers being published. We have lots of great things coming out of the ID research program. We want to see ID grow, continue to progress and grow as a science. When ID gets pushed into the public schools, that tends to politicize the debate. It takes the debate out of the lab and pushes it into sort of like the courtroom or the political sphere. And that then politicizes the debate, which results in increased persecution of pro-ID scientists and scholars who are trying to develop the case for intelligent design in the academy. So we really discourage public school educators and policymakers from bringing ID into the public school context. Now, we understand that evolution is already being taught there, and we don't want to leave those folks high and dry. So what we recommend for public school teachers generally is to teach the evidence for and against evolution, which is already in the curriculum. So if you're already going to teach it factually correct, teach it accurately, teach students, the pro-evolution evidence that's probably in the textbooks. But if there are legitimate scientific critiques of what's in the textbooks, then teach them about that too. Okay. And let's see, let the students use this as an opportunity to develop critical thinking skills, to weigh the evidence on both sides and form their own conclusions. This is the best way to teach students science anyway. So we think that teaching the evidence for and against evolution is really the best way, scientifically and pedagogically speaking, to teach evolution. And that's what we encourage folks to do. Now, that being said, I can't speak to your teacher friend's specific situation. We don't want anybody to get, fired. And unfortunately, most public school teachers have very little academic freedom, sort of as a general matter. If an administrator or a school board does not want a teacher saying X, Y, or Z, they have a lot of power to tell teachers not to say X, Y, and Z at penalty of being fired. There are a few states that have what we call academic freedom laws. We've been really supportive of states and actually helped some of these states to get good language into their bills to pass academic freedom laws that protect the rights of teachers to critique evolution or to talk about these topics, controversial scientific topics, objectively without having to worry about losing their jobs. So and I have no idea where your friend lives, if she lives in that kind of a context. But again, we might be able to point folks if they're in one of these few states with good policies on the books, there are some protections there. But at the end of the day, it's a tough world. We live, this July, Jacob, is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial. And the Scopes trial was July 1925. And that was when a bunch of, fundamentalists, I would say that they were very misguided in what they did, but they criminalized the teaching of human evolution in Tennessee public schools. Now, I don't think that a scientific idea should ever be criminalized to talk about it. Okay. I might disagree with it, but absolutely, you should never tell people it's illegal or prevent them from being allowed to have the conversation. I think that that's definitely a very wrong way to go about dealing with this issue. But Justice Scalia, if you remember him, he passed away, was it like 8 or 9 years ago now? He once said that today we are living in a time of scopes in reverse, okay? Where instead of evolution being criminalized, it's those who are promoting non-Darwinian views who are being attacked and persecuted and censored. And that really is true, Jacob. We still have this power dynamic where we can't have, in most places, I would say, in most public schools or universities even, we don't have free speech and true scientific intellectual freedom on the topic of evolution. But today, the power dynamics have shifted exactly 180 degrees, where it's the evolutionists who hold the power, and they are, in many, many cases, censoring scientists who would challenge Darwinism or educators who would challenge Darwinism or support ID. So we got to stand up for free speech, and it's really unfortunate that this is just the world that we live in today.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that answer. I think that's helpful for her and maybe countless others who are teachers and wrestling with the same issues. It's a good point, right? You don't want to risk getting into that political realm, especially given that trial that was now 100 years ago, which is crazy. But it's helpful, and I think she'll appreciate that. So thank you for giving that answer. And Casey, we are at time. I might have to have you back for the host of other questions I have for you. But thank you so much for jumping on, Casey. I think this was fruitful for me. I'm sure it was helpful for our listeners as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate the great questions. And you clearly have studied this issue a lot and understand it pretty well. So thanks for the great conversation.
Awesome. Well, to our listeners, thank you guys for tuning in, and God bless.